On a cold January afternoon in 1919, the streets of Boston's North End were alive with the ordinary rhythm of city life. Dockworkers hauled crates across the wharves, children played stickball in narrow alleys, and women carried groceries home through the labyrinth of tenements. It was a neighborhood that always smelled faintly of the harbor, of coal smoke, of bread baking from Italian kitchens. Nothing in the winter air suggested that in a matter of minutes, the very heart of this community would be consumed by a disaster so strange, so grotesque, that it would forever be etched into the darker pages of American history. When people first hear about it today, they often smile in disbelief. A flood of molasses? Surely that must be a joke, or at best some exaggerated anecdote handed down by storytellers. But to those who lived through it, there was nothing humorous about watching a 25-foot wall of sticky, suffocating syrup sweep through their streets like a liquid avalanche. 21 people would die, more than 150 would be injured, and countless others would carry scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Horses drowned in slow agony, buildings collapsed like matchsticks, and the entire North End was left coated in a sickly sweet residue that clung to everything, even the air, for weeks and months to come. Imagine standing in that neighborhood at exactly 12:30 p.m. on January 15th. At first, a deep groaning sound reverberates through the ground, metallic and alien, like the cry of a giant creature in pain. Then, without warning, a massive steel tank bursts apart with a thunderous crack. The sound is so loud, so violent, that many residents later said it resembled an explosion or even an earthquake. What follows is almost unimaginable. 2 million gallons of molasses, weighing more than 26 million pounds, erupt from the ruptured tank. The syrup surges outward at an estimated 35 miles per hour, faster than most people could run, and with a force comparable to a freight train. For the victims caught in its path, there was no time to react, no time to flee. They were swallowed whole by a dark tide that defied belief. Survivors described the sensation as something close to drowning, yet different in the most horrifying ways. In water, you can swim, thrash, struggle toward the surface. But in molasses, every movement was slow, impossible, like trying to claw through cement that shifted and tightened with every breath. Once it clung to your clothes, your skin, your hair, it pulled you down, suffocating you as surely as if you had been buried alive. Horses thrashed wildly until they collapsed, exhausted and gasping. Men and women screamed for help, their cries muffled by the syrup coating their mouths. Children vanished under the wave, leaving nothing but frantic parents clawing at the sticky current. The disaster unfolded in less than 5 minutes, but for those caught inside, time stretched endlessly, as though the very seconds were thickened by the substance drowning them. And when the wave finally settled, when the syrup slowed and began to pool in the streets, the devastation it left behind was almost surreal. Entire buildings had been lifted off their foundations and crushed against the ground. The elevated train tracks twisted and buckled, their steel frames bent like toys. Wooden carts and automobiles were snapped apart and hurled like debris in a storm. The air reeked of sweetness, but that sweetness masked the stench of death, the cries of the injured, and the terror that gripped the neighborhood. Witnesses said that even hours later, they could hear faint groans coming from beneath the hardened surface of molasses, the desperate sounds of people trapped in pockets of syrup they could not escape. For many, rescue would come too late. The sheer absurdity of the event has caused it, over the last century, to be retold in tones of curiosity or even amusement. Headlines in later years dubbed it the Great Molasses Flood, a phrase that sounds almost whimsical, like something from a child's imagination. But to dismiss it as a bizarre accident is to strip away the reality of human suffering that played out in those streets. It was not an accident in the truest sense, nor a freak of nature. It was the result of human decisions, of greed, negligence, and the arrogant assumption that a massive steel tank holding millions of gallons of syrup could be safely built without proper testing or oversight. That arrogance turned molasses into a weapon. It transformed a staple of kitchens and candy shops into a force as lethal as fire, water, or steel. As we peel back the layers of this strange and haunting story, we'll see how the North End's immigrant families lived under the shadow of that massive storage tank, how the Purity Distilling Company cut corners in its construction, and how the bitter cold of January mixed with the heat of fermentation to create a disaster waiting to happen. We'll hear the voices of survivors who carried the memory like a wound, and we'll examine the legal and scientific aftermath that reshaped corporate accountability in America. What begins as an almost absurd anecdote becomes, on closer inspection, a tragedy steeped in dark lessons about industrial greed and the fragility of human life. The Great Molasses Flood is more than just a strange piece of history. It is a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary substances, in the wrong hands, can become instruments of horror. Boston in 1919 was a city teetering on the edge of transformation. The Great War had just ended the year before, and like much of America, Boston was adjusting to a world that felt unstable and uncertain. Soldiers were returning home, carrying not only stories of the trenches but also the influenza pandemic that had swept across the globe in 1918. Families buried their dead while also trying to find normalcy again. On the surface, the city bustled with life. Streetcars rattled across cobblestones, the harbor teemed with cargo ships unloading goods, and immigrants poured into neighborhoods, searching for work and community. Yet beneath that rhythm of daily life, Boston was restless, divided, and volatile. The North End, where our story unfolds, was the most densely populated part of the city. Narrow streets crisscrossed in chaotic patterns, lined with brick tenements that housed mostly Italian immigrants, many of them recent arrivals. The neighborhood had a reputation, one painted by outsiders as dirty, overcrowded, and dangerous. But within those winding streets, life was vibrant. Market stalls overflowed with fresh produce, vendors sold roasted chestnuts in the winter air, and churches rang their bells to mark baptisms, weddings, and funerals. The North End was both a sanctuary and a cage. For its residents, it was home, but for city leaders and wealthy elites, it was often a place to be controlled, policed, and neglected. This neighborhood, packed with families, schools, and small businesses, would soon find itself crushed by a disaster born of decisions made in boardrooms far away from the lives it destroyed. Boston itself was already a city under tension. Politically, it was a hotbed of labor unrest. The economy after the war was unstable, prices were rising, and workers were demanding better pay and safer conditions. In the months that followed the molasses flood, Boston would be rocked by the infamous Boston police strike, where officers abandoned their posts, plunging the city into chaos. But even in early 1919, those tensions were bubbling. Rumors of radical anarchists and socialist agitators swirled through newspapers. Just months earlier, anarchist bombings had rattled cities across America, including Boston. Suspicion and fear clung to every street corner, especially in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods like the North End. Layered over this was the looming shadow of prohibition. The United States was on the cusp of outlawing alcohol, and the Purity Distilling Company, along with its parent company United States Industrial Alcohol, was racing to maximize profits before the new laws took effect. Molasses wasn't just for baking cookies or candy, it was a vital ingredient in producing industrial alcohol, used in everything from munitions during the war to the rum that filled saloons. To many ordinary Bostonians, the giant molasses tank in the North End was simply part of the industrial landscape, one more looming structure in a city defined by its factories and warehouses. But to the company, that tank was a gold mine, a reservoir of profit waiting to be tapped. For the immigrant families who lived in the shadow of the tank, it was a looming oddity, an enormous steel drum rising 50 feet into the sky, dominating the edge of Commercial Street. Children often played nearby, sneaking up to touch the riveted walls, daring each other to climb as high as they could before being chased off. Some of those same children would later remember the groaning noises the tank made, the way it occasionally leaked sticky syrup that attracted swarms of flies. Residents complained about it, but in a city where immigrant voices were often dismissed, their concerns carried little weight. The company's solution was not to repair the tank properly, but to slap a coat of brown paint over the rivulets of molasses so they would blend in. Out of sight, out of mind. The broader mood of Boston in those days made it easier for corporate neglect to slip by unchecked. The city's leaders were far more concerned with cracking down on labor strikes, monitoring anarchist cells, and preparing for prohibition than they were with ensuring the safety of a working-class neighborhood. To them, the molasses tank was a symbol of industry, not a looming threat. But as we look back, the irony is chilling. At a time when Boston's papers were filled with headlines about bombs, radicals, and foreign threats, the true danger to the city was sitting quietly, right in the middle of its own backyard, disguised as something harmless and sweet. The winter of 1919 was cold but inconsistent. Temperatures swung from freezing to unseasonably warm, causing the ground to crack and the harbor ice to shift. The tank holding more than 2 million gallons of molasses was already stressed from within, its thin steel walls buckling under the pressure. Workers heard it groan and rattle. Some even reported that the rivets sounded like gunfire as they popped free. These were warning signs, clear and ominous, but in a climate of fear and distraction, no one took decisive action. It is one of the cruel ironies of history. The city obsessed over imagined threats while ignoring the very real catastrophe brewing in plain sight. At the same time, Boston was still recovering from the Spanish flu epidemic. The North End, overcrowded and poor, had been hit hard. Families were still mourning lost children and parents. The sudden loss of loved ones was already a fresh wound in the community, and perhaps that is why, when the disaster struck, the grief was all the more devastating. These families, already battered by war, disease, and poverty, would now be drowned in a flood so bizarre and unexpected that it would seem almost like divine punishment, or perhaps, in the minds of some, a cruel cosmic joke. When we picture Boston in 1919, we need to strip away the modern skyline and imagine the gritty, soot-stained city of a century ago. Streetcars rumbled across rickety wooden trestles, horses clopped through slush-covered streets, children carried coal buckets up steep staircases. This was a city in transition, caught between the 19th century and the modern world, between tradition and upheaval. And in that fragile moment, standing at the crossroads of industrial progress and human cost, a tank of molasses waited silently for its chance to rupture, to turn an ordinary January afternoon into one of the strangest and deadliest disasters in American history. The storage tank loomed over Boston's North End like a steel giant. At 50 feet high and 90 feet across, it was almost impossible to ignore. To children growing up on Commercial Street, it was simply part of the neighborhood skyline, a mysterious industrial landmark that cast long shadows over the tenements. To company officials, it was a symbol of ambition and profit. But to history, it would be remembered as an instrument of death. The tank belonged to the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Corporation. Its purpose was simple: to hold imported molasses arriving by ship before the syrup could be piped to Cambridge and fermented into industrial alcohol. The alcohol was then sold to manufacturers, munitions companies, and rum distillers. In the years leading up to Prohibition, demand for alcohol was soaring, and molasses was money in liquid form. The larger the tank, the larger the profit. That was the thinking when the decision was made in 1915 to build one of the biggest storage tanks in the country, right in the middle of a working-class neighborhood. But from the very beginning, the tank was flawed. Construction was rushed, and engineers cut corners. The steel walls of the tank were barely an inch thick, far too thin to safely hold 3 million gallons of heavy syrup. In fact, later tests would reveal that the steel used was brittle and lacked enough manganese, a crucial element that gives metal flexibility. Without it, the steel was prone to cracking under stress. In a proper engineering project, safety tests would have been conducted. A tank of this size should have been filled with water first, to ensure it could withstand the enormous pressure. But in the case of the Boston molasses tank, no such precautions were taken. Instead, the tank was filled with molasses almost immediately after construction. Within days, the first leaks appeared. Local residents noticed sticky brown streaks running down the sides of the tank, glistening in the sunlight. Children would sometimes scoop the leaking syrup into cups, treating it as a free sweet. Neighbors complained that their homes and streets were constantly plagued by the sticky mess. The sound of groaning metal echoed whenever the tank was filled, a low and unsettling moan that some described as if the structure were alive, straining under its own burden. Employees at Purity Distilling were well aware of the problem. One worker later admitted that whenever the tank was being filled, he would walk nervously along Commercial Street, hoping he could escape quickly if the worst happened. The leaks became so obvious that residents began to raise their concerns to city officials. But the company had an answer: not to repair or reinforce the structure, but to paint it. A coat of brown paint covered the streaks of molasses, hiding the evidence of leakage from the casual observer. Out of sight, out of mind. It was corporate negligence at its most brazen, and the city, either through indifference or corruption, allowed it to continue. For the people living in the North End, the tank was an uneasy neighbor. Some learned to ignore it, just another hazard in a city full of factories, railroads, and warehouses. Others felt a constant sense of unease. The groans and creaks, the sticky leaks, the occasional sharp pops as rivets loosened, these were not the sounds of a stable structure. They were the warnings of something strained to its breaking point. Still, no one in the neighborhood could have imagined the scale of destruction that would come when the tank finally gave way. Part of what made the tank so dangerous was the sheer weight of its contents. 2 million gallons of molasses sounds almost whimsical, but in reality it represented more than 26 million pounds of pressure pushing outward in all directions. Each rivet, each seam, each steel plate was under immense stress every single day. Unlike water, molasses is far denser and exerts far greater pressure. Add to this the natural process of fermentation occurring inside the tank. The molasses would sometimes bubble and expand as gases built up, and the result was a ticking time bomb disguised as a container of syrup. Boston newspapers occasionally mentioned the tank, often in positive tones, praising the booming industry it represented. The United States Industrial Alcohol Corporation was a powerful company, and its executives were well connected. To them, the molasses tank was a monument to progress. To the immigrant families who lived in its shadow, it was something else entirely, a looming presence that seemed as unstable as the city's politics. And politics, too, played a role in silencing criticism. In a time when immigrants had little voice in city affairs, the complaints of Italian families carried little weight against the interests of a powerful corporation. The tank became part of the daily rhythm of the neighborhood. Ships arrived from the Caribbean, offloading their sticky cargo. Workers pumped the molasses into the tank, listening uneasily to the metal groan. Children played tag in its shadow. Mothers scolded their sons for coming home with syrup-stained clothes after touching the leaks. Residents grumbled about the flies it attracted in the summer and the sticky residue it left on sidewalks. These small annoyances, these daily reminders of the tank's presence, would later become chilling memories, the little signs everyone wished they had taken more seriously. In hindsight, the disaster feels inevitable. But at the time, it was simply accepted. Industrial accidents were common in early 20th century America. Factories exploded, mines collapsed, ships sank, and people often shrugged it off as the cost of progress. Corporations had little incentive to prioritize safety. Insurance was cheap, lawsuits were rare, and the lives of immigrant workers were considered expendable. The molasses tank in Boston was a perfect symbol of that era, a massive, unstable structure, built for profit, ignored by regulators, and looming over the powerless. As January 1919 approached, the pressure inside the tank was reaching a critical point. Shipments of molasses had been arriving rapidly, and the tank was nearly full. Residents noticed the leaks becoming worse, and some even joked about the tank bursting one day, as if imagining such a ridiculous possibility could make it less threatening. But jokes turned to unease when the sounds grew louder, the rivets pinging like gunshots. The steel giant was straining at its seams, and no amount of paint could disguise the danger. When we think about the towering tank of death, as history would later describe it, we must see it not as a random accident but as a monument to negligence. Every groan of its walls was a warning. Every sticky leak was a plea for attention. But in 1919 Boston, those warnings were drowned out by profit margins, political distractions, and a disregard for immigrant voices. The tank stood as a silent threat until the day it could no longer contain its burden. And when it finally ruptured, the consequences would be swift, unstoppable, and catastrophic. Molasses may seem like an odd thing to have killed a city. Thick, sticky, and sweet, it's the kind of substance we associate with gingerbread cookies, candy shops, and kitchen cupboards, not mass destruction. But in the early 20th century, molasses was far more than a culinary sweetener. It was big business, an industrial commodity as vital to America's economy as oil or coal. The Boston tank was not just a neighborhood oddity, it was a reservoir of profit, built to fuel a market about to shift dramatically under the weight of prohibition. Molasses has a long, tangled history, rooted in colonial trade and slavery. For centuries, ships carried molasses from the Caribbean to North America, where it was distilled into rum, one of the cornerstones of the so-called triangle trade. By 1919, rum was still a booming industry, but molasses was also used in the production of industrial alcohol. This alcohol was crucial not only for liquor but also for the manufacture of explosives, munitions, and chemical products. During World War I, the demand for industrial alcohol skyrocketed, and companies like United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA, Purity Distilling's parent company, raked in enormous profits. The tank in Boston's North End was a product of this wartime boom. It was designed not as a monument to efficiency or safety, but as a shortcut to maximize storage and distribution. With the war over, alcohol production was shifting toward a new battlefront, prohibition. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, and though it wouldn't take effect until 1920, liquor producers and alcohol companies scrambled to make the most of their final year of legal production. For USIA, the race was on to store and distribute as much molasses as possible, fueling both rum distilleries and the industrial alcohol trade before the curtain fell. This looming ban on liquor created a frenzy of activity. Bars and saloons across the nation stocked up. Bootleggers prepared to corner the black market. And industrial giants like USIA knew that fortunes could be won or lost, depending on how quickly they could push their product. In this context, the Boston tank wasn't simply a storage container. It was a ticking cash register, each gallon of molasses another step toward financial security in uncertain times. The placement of the tank in the north end was strategic but callous. The neighborhood was close to the harbor, making it easy to unload molasses shipments from Caribbean tankers. It was also densely populated by immigrants who lacked the political clout to challenge the company. In wealthier parts of Boston, such a massive industrial structure would have faced scrutiny. But in the North End, where Italian and Irish families struggled to make ends meet, corporate interests triumphed without resistance. The lives of the neighborhood's residents were considered an acceptable risk in the pursuit of profit. Documents from the era reveal that usurer executives knew the tank had problems. Complaints from workers about leaks, groans, and ominous sounds were ignored or brushed aside. The company was in too much of a hurry. Every day the tank sat idle was money lost. Instead of rebuilding or reinforcing the structure, they pressed forward, filling it with millions of gallons of molasses. It was a gamble, and like all gambles, someone would pay the price. But in this case, it would not be the executives in their offices. It would be the families of the North End, trapped in tenements and schools when the flood came. This greed-driven negligence was part of a larger pattern in early 20th century America. Industry moved faster than regulation. Railroads cut corners with safety standards. Coal mines ignored ventilation. Factories ran dangerous machinery with little regard for their workers. In an era before the New Deal reforms of the 1930s, corporations largely policed themselves, or rather, failed to police themselves. The molasses tank was built in this climate of unchecked ambition, a physical embodiment of the belief that profit outweighed risk, that progress justified danger. The irony of the molasses flood lies in its sheer absurdity. This wasn't a dynamite factory or a coal mine. It wasn't a volatile chemical plant or a munitions depot. It was molasses, the same syrup mothers poured into recipes, the same sticky sweetness found in every pantry. Yet in industrial quantities, contained within a poorly built tank, molasses transformed from a household ingredient into a deadly force. This is the unsettling truth at the core of the story. Ordinary things, scaled up in the name of profit, can become catastrophic. In January 1919, as the tank filled to capacity, its walls strained against the immense weight. Residents joked about it, laughed nervously at the idea of a flood of molasses. Some even dipped cups into the leaks for free syrup. But beneath the dark humor was unease. People knew something was wrong. The creaks and groans weren't normal. The leaks weren't harmless. They were warnings, but warnings dismissed by those who held power. USIA's priority was not safety, it was speed. The company was focused on beating prohibition, on securing contracts, on maximizing revenue. The fears of immigrant families in the North End simply didn't matter. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Great Molasses Flood was not an accident in the truest sense. It was the result of choices made in boardrooms where human lives were measured against profit margins and found expendable. The disaster was baked into the tank's very design, into the rush to build, into the decision to paint over leaks instead of fixing them, into the relentless pursuit of profit at any cost. When the walls of the tank finally gave way, the flood was not just a natural consequence of physics, but of greed. And that greed, that reckless pursuit of wealth, meant that on January 15, 1919, the people of Boston's North End would face something almost unimaginable: a wall of molasses surging through their streets, drowning their loved ones, destroying their homes, and forever staining their neighborhood with tragedy. The morning of January 15, 1919, began like any other winter day in Boston's North End. The sky was pale, the air crisp, the streets damp with thawing snow. On Commercial Street, workers bustled in and out of warehouses, dockhands carried crates from the harbor, and children darted between the alleys, their laughter echoing off brick walls. The giant molasses tank stood silently at the edge of the neighborhood, filled nearly to capacity with over 2 million gallons of syrup, its steel skin stretched thin and groaning under the strain. By noon, the streets had quieted for the midday lull. Horses stood tethered to carts, steam curled from manhole covers, and the scent of coal smoke lingered. Inside homes and shops, families went about their routines, unaware that just minutes separated them from catastrophe. At exactly 12:30 p.m., witnesses later reported hearing a sound unlike anything they had ever known. Some described it as a deep rumble, like thunder rolling beneath the earth. Others said it was a metallic screech, the agonized wail of tortured steel. One worker swore it sounded like the roar of machine gunfire, rapid pops as rivets shot free from the tank with lethal force. Whatever the description, all agreed it was a noise that froze the blood. Then, in an instant, the tank gave way. The massive steel walls ripped apart with a crack like an explosion. Plates of metal tore free, soaring across the neighborhood like shrapnel. And from the gaping wound surged a dark, viscous torrent, a wall of molasses 25 feet high, moving with terrifying speed. Later calculations would estimate the wave raced at 35 miles per hour. To those who saw it, it looked less like syrup and more like a tidal wave of sludge, a monstrous force tearing through everything in its path. The first to be hit were workers at the nearby firehouse and a small freight office. Entire buildings shuddered as the flood slammed into them with a force equal to tons of dynamite. The elevated railway, running parallel to Commercial Street, trembled as the molasses struck its support beams, twisting steel and splintering wood. Train cars above swayed violently, and it was only through the quick action of a motorman that a catastrophe on the tracks was narrowly avoided. Down on the street, chaos erupted. Horses tethered to carts reared back in terror, their screams piercing the winter air. But they had no chance of escape. The wave swallowed them instantly, dragging them under and pinning their thrashing bodies until they stilled. Men and women caught in the open had seconds to react. Some tried to run, but the sticky wave overtook them almost instantly, pulling them down like quicksand. Others were slammed against buildings or crushed beneath debris as the torrent carried fences, wagons, and entire walls with it. For the children playing nearby, the disaster was incomprehensible. One moment, they were laughing in the street. The next, they were engulfed in a suffocating tide of syrup. A boy was seen clinging to a lamppost, his small body encased in molasses, screaming for help before the weight pulled him under. Another child, running for safety, tripped and disappeared in seconds, leaving behind only a glove floating in sludge. Parents rushed into the streets, their cries of panic joining the chorus of screams, the neighing of horses, and the groan of collapsing wood. Inside the firehouse, firefighters heard the thunder outside only seconds before the wall of molasses slammed into their building. The structure collapsed in an instant, burying men under heavy beams and coating them in sticky darkness. Those who survived the initial impact found themselves trapped, struggling to breathe as the syrup filled their mouths and noses. Rescuers later described the horror of hearing muffled shouts from beneath the hardened surface, voices crying out and then going silent. The physics of the disaster made survival almost impossible. Molasses is denser than water, and once it gripped a body, it was nearly impossible to escape. Arms and legs moved in slow motion, every effort draining energy. Victims who managed to keep their heads above the surface found themselves suffocating anyway, their mouths filled with syrup that clung to throats and lungs. It was not drowning in the traditional sense, it was smothering, suffocation by sweetness turned deadly. As the wave rolled on, it carried its destruction deeper into the North End. Houses were torn from foundations. Wooden beams snapped like twigs. People who had been safe indoors suddenly found their homes collapsing around them, walls bursting as the molasses forced its way inside. Entire families were trapped in kitchens and bedrooms, coated in sticky brown sludge, their cries muffled. The force of the wave even pushed across Commercial Street into the Boston waterfront, slamming against docks and spilling into the harbor. The dark syrup mixed with salt water, spreading the disaster further. Witnesses described the harbor itself turning brown, the tide stained with molasses and littered with debris, wood, barrels, clothing, and bodies drifting together in a grotesque stew. For those lucky enough to avoid the direct impact, the scene unfolding was surreal and nightmarish. Survivors described the air filled with a sickly sweet smell so overpowering it made them nauseous. They watched as friends, neighbors, and even strangers struggled, their movements slowing, their cries fading as they sank. One man later recalled the sound of silence that followed the first roar, punctuated only by the faint moans of the dying. The entire disaster lasted mere minutes. By 12:35, the tank was empty, its contents spread across 2 city blocks. The wave of destruction was over, but what it left behind was almost worse, a landscape coated in molasses 2 to 3 feet deep, with pockets much higher in places. The syrup hardened quickly in the cold air, trapping victims where they fell. Horses appeared frozen mid-stride, their bodies encased in sticky resin. Buildings leaned at strange angles, half collapsed but glued together by molasses. Streets were unrecognizable, turned into a sea of dark sludge where nothing moved but the faint ripples of congealing syrup. Those who survived stumbled in shock through the devastation. Clothes torn, hair matted, their bodies coated in syrup, they looked less like people than wax figures half melted by some infernal fire. Mothers searched frantically for children. Men clawed at the molasses with bare hands, digging for friends who had vanished beneath the surface. The sticky substance clung to everything, weighing rescuers down, exhausting them as quickly as it had their victims. For those trapped but alive, The seconds stretched into an eternity. Imagine the terror of being pinned beneath debris, unable to move, your chest compressed by the weight of syrup, every breath a desperate, choking gasp. Some survivors later said they could hear muffled voices nearby, others buried in the molasses, calling for help, begging, crying. Slowly, those voices fell silent. The flood had not only destroyed the North End physically, it smothered it in a suffocating silence. In less than 5 minutes, the neighborhood had been transformed into something unrecognizable. A place of life and laughter was now a graveyard coated in brown. The molasses flood had turned an ordinary January afternoon into one of the most bizarre and horrifying disasters in American history. And as the survivors looked upon the ruin, streets glistening dark in the winter sun, bodies half submerged, horses and wagons twisted into grotesque sculptures, they realized that this was only the beginning. The horror of the flood was immediate, but the battle to rescue, recover, and reckon with the devastation was just beginning. The roar had faded, but in its wake came something worse: silence, punctuated only by cries of pain and desperate calls for help. The molasses wave had passed, leaving behind 2 blocks of devastation in Boston's North End. But what it left was not stillness. It was a battlefield of sticky sludge, broken bodies, and collapsing structures. Survivors would later recall the uncanny quiet of the disaster zone, the way the heavy syrup seemed to muffle sound, swallowing screams before they could carry. And yet, beneath that silence, you could still hear faint voices, muffled groans, and the crack of wood as buildings settled into their new, broken positions. Those first minutes after the flood were critical. Neighbors, stunned but alive, rushed to help. Men tore at the molasses with their hands, trying to dig out victims who were buried waist-deep or even fully submerged. But the syrup clung to everything. Unlike water, it would not simply be pushed aside. Instead, it sucked at fingers and arms, trapping rescuers as surely as it trapped the dying. It was like trying to move through glue, one man later said. The more you fought it, the harder it held you. The first official responders were from the firehouse that the flood had nearly destroyed. Station 31 sat right on Commercial Street, and when the wave hit, its walls buckled, pinning men beneath beams and syrup. Some firefighters were killed instantly, but others managed to crawl free, battered and sticky, only to begin rescuing their comrades. One fire lieutenant, badly injured, kept digging at the wreckage despite his wounds, trying to reach the muffled cries of those trapped beneath. Word spread quickly across Boston. Police rushed to the scene, followed by more firefighters, the Red Cross, and eventually sailors from a nearby Navy ship. They arrived to find streets transformed into a viscous swamp. Boots stuck fast in the sludge, horses sank belly deep, and wagons overturned. Stretchers had to be carried by men wading knee-deep in syrup, each step an agonizing effort. The rescuers faced not only the stickiness but the cold. January air froze the outer layers of molasses into a hard crust, while the inside remained liquid. Wading through it was like breaking through ice into a swamp, every step uncertain, every rescue slowed. Victims who survived the initial wave often did not survive long after. Some suffocated as the syrup hardened around their faces, sealing their mouths and noses. Others drowned slowly, pinned under debris while molasses filled their lungs. Rescuers told stories of finding people who seemed alive, hands still reaching upward, bodies struggling, only to realize they had already gone still, their last desperate attempts frozen in place. One man recalled the horror of pulling at a woman's arm only to find it would not budge. She was glued so firmly in place that freeing her would have required tearing her apart. The human toll was devastating, but animals suffered too. Dozens of horses drowned in the flood, their bodies found days later in grotesque positions, eyes wide with terror. Some rescuers tried to save them, but the syrup held them fast. Firefighters eventually had to shoot several horses on the spot, ending their suffering when it became clear they could not be pulled free. The sound of gunshots echoed across the sticky wasteland, grim punctuation to the screams of the dying. 4 hours, rescuers worked in a nightmare landscape. They used axes, ropes, and even shovels to dig through molasses that clung to everything. Stretchers stuck to the ground, boots tore free of feet, and men collapsed from exhaustion. One Navy sailor later described it as the hardest work I ever did, harder than war. The Red Cross set up first aid stations in nearby buildings, treating injuries ranging from broken bones to chemical burns caused by the syrup's fermentation. Many victims arrived with skin raw and blistered, their bodies rubbed raw by the abrasive, sticky substance. By nightfall, lanterns were brought in, casting a sickly glow over the brown, glistening streets. The cries for help had grown fewer. replaced by the grim task of recovering bodies. Some victims were found quickly, but others remained missing for days. The molasses swallowed them whole, their bodies only discovered when the sludge was cut away. One young girl was not found until 4 days later, her body so entombed in hardened syrup that it took hours to free her. The death toll rose steadily. 21 people would ultimately be counted among the dead, but in those first nights, no one knew the final number. Families wandered the ruins, searching for missing loved ones, their shoes pulled from their feet by the syrup as they moved. Mothers cried out children's names, while fathers clawed at rubble with bare hands, their palms torn and bleeding. Rescuers spoke of the smell, too, the overpowering sweetness of molasses mixed with blood, sweat, and death. It clung to clothes and hair, seeped into nostrils, and lingered in the lungs until men gagged from nausea. Journalists descended on the scene, their stories filling newspapers nationwide within days. Headlines called it the Boston Molasses Disaster and Death by Syrup. Some reports carried a tone of disbelief, as though the strangeness of molasses overshadowed the human suffering. But for those who stood knee-deep in the sticky ruins, there was nothing absurd about it. Reporters described men and women coated in brown from head to toe, barely recognizable as human, stumbling past collapsed homes and shattered storefronts. It was like a battlefield, one wrote, except the enemy was a river of syrup. As night turned into morning, the scale of destruction became clearer. More than 150 people had been injured. Dozens of buildings were destroyed or badly damaged. Entire families were displaced, their homes unlivable, their possessions ruined. The molasses had seeped into everything: floorboards, furniture, clothing, and hardened there, impossible to clean. The disaster did not just take lives, it erased livelihoods. Rescue work continued for days. Firemen and volunteers hacked through hardened molasses with picks and saws, slowly uncovering bodies. Some were found in groups, clinging to one another in their final moments. Others were found alone, trapped under debris or pinned against walls. The condition of the corpses was shocking. The syrup preserved them in grotesque detail, coating faces and limbs so thoroughly they looked like wax figures. The task of removing them was slow and agonizing, each body pried from the glue-like mass with care. Even weeks later, the search was not over. The molasses flood had carried people into the harbor, where currents swept them out to sea. Bodies surfaced as late as summer, swollen and dark, unrecognizable except to grieving families. The sticky tide had claimed its victims and refused to give them up easily. In the immediate aftermath, Boston struggled to comprehend what had happened. How could something as benign as molasses cause so much death? The survivors, however, had no doubts. To them, the flood was a nightmare they could never escape. Children woke screaming from dreams of sticky waves. Mothers wept over lost sons and daughters. Fathers cursed the tank they had always suspected was unsafe. And through it all, the neighborhood reeked of molasses, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. The Great Molasses Flood was not only a disaster of steel and syrup, it was a disaster of humanity. It revealed the fragility of life in a city where industry reigned supreme and ordinary families bore the cost. In those days of chaos and grief, Boston's North End was transformed into a place of mourning, its narrow streets echoing with the cries of rescue workers, the weeping of families, and the haunting silence of the dead. In the days that followed the Great Molasses Flood, grief gave way to anger. 21 lives had been lost. More than 150 others had been injured. Homes were destroyed, families displaced, livelihoods ruined. The sweet smell of molasses clung to the North End for weeks, but beneath that sugary perfume was something sour: suspicion. Someone, the survivors believed, had to be held accountable. The tank had always looked dangerous to those who lived in its shadow. Residents of the North End, many of them immigrants with little power to protest, had long whispered that the massive steel container was unsafe. They had seen the dark rivulets of syrup oozing from its seams, had heard the groans of stressed metal, had even watched children scoop up leaked molasses with cups to take home. But their warnings went unheeded. Now, after the flood, their fears had been proven tragically correct. Within hours of the disaster, rumors spread that anarchists were to blame. The year was 1919, and America was in the midst of the first Red Scare. Bombings by radical groups had rattled cities across the country. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which owned the tank, had reason to fear sabotage. After all, the molasses was destined for distilleries that produced alcohol for munitions, an industry targeted by radicals. Company officials wasted no time floating the theory that their tank had been deliberately destroyed. In press statements, they insisted the disaster could not have been the result of negligence. No, this was the work of anarchists, enemies of the state who had struck at Boston's heart. But the people of the North End were not so easily convinced. They had lived beside the tank. They had seen its flaws with their own eyes. And as the sticky ruins were examined more closely, doubts about sabotage only grew. Investigators found twisted steel that seemed too brittle, rivets that had popped like corks, seams that had clearly strained for months under pressure. The truth, it seemed, was simpler and uglier. The tank had been poorly built and poorly maintained. The city of Boston launched an investigation almost immediately, but it was soon clear this would not be a small inquiry. The flood had destroyed not only lives but property across a wide swath of the city. Damages climbed into the millions. Dozens of lawsuits were filed against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, all demanding compensation. What followed was the longest civil trial in Massachusetts history up to that time, lasting more than 3 years. The case drew national attention. Lawyers for the victims painted a portrait of corporate greed and negligence. They argued that the tank, hastily constructed in 1915, had never been properly tested. There were no engineering blueprints, no stress tests, no safety inspections. The man who oversaw its construction had no training in structural engineering. Witnesses testified that the tank leaked constantly, so much so that residents joked about the molasses rain it produced. The company's response had been laughable. They painted the tank brown to hide the leaks from public view. The defense countered with their sabotage theory. They called experts who insisted the tank had been sound and could only have been destroyed by explosives. They pointed to the political climate of the time, reminding the court of anarchist bombings in Boston and elsewhere. Surely, they argued, radicals had targeted the molasses tank to strike at capitalism and war profiteering. But the theory was thin. No evidence of explosives was ever found. No anarchist group claimed responsibility. And the structural flaws of the tank were impossible to ignore. As the trial wore on, harrowing testimony from survivors filled the courtroom. Men and women described the horror of the wave, the suffocating stickiness, the desperate struggle to breathe. Parents told of children torn from their arms and lost in the syrup. Firefighters recounted digging through molasses to reach trapped comrades, their voices muffled and fading. These testimonies made it clear, this was not just a freak accident. This was a human-made disaster. The court also heard from experts in metallurgy and engineering. They analyzed fragments of the tank steel and rivets, showing that the metal was brittle and far too thin for the pressure it was asked to contain. Modern analysis would later confirm this. The steel lacked enough manganese, making it prone to cracking. Combined with shoddy construction and lack of oversight, the disaster had been inevitable. But the trial was not only about metallurgy and engineering, it was about responsibility. Who should pay for the lives lost and the damage done? The company argued that it could not have foreseen such a disaster, that it had acted in good faith. The plaintiffs countered that the company had chosen profit over safety, ignoring warnings and cutting corners. The trial dragged on for years, with thousands of pages of testimony and evidence. It became a battle not just of facts but of philosophy. Was this disaster the result of malice from outside forces, or negligence from within? Slowly, the scales tipped toward negligence. The sabotage theory collapsed under scrutiny, and the image of the leaking, groaning tank, ignored by those in power, became impossible to deny. In 1925, Judge Hugh Ogden finally delivered his ruling. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was found liable for the disaster. The court concluded that the tank had been improperly constructed, poorly maintained, and destined to fail. Sabotage, the judge ruled, played no role. The company was ordered to pay more than $600,000 in damages, equivalent to over $9 million today. Families of the victims received around $7,000 each for their losses. It was, at the time, one of the largest settlements ever awarded in a civil case. The verdict brought some measure of justice, but for the people of the North End, no amount of money could erase the horror. 21 lives had been lost, cut short in the most bizarre and agonizing of ways. Survivors carried scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. Children grew up with nightmares of sticky waves, adults with memories of loved ones suffocated before their eyes. And yet, the trial had broader consequences. It marked a turning point in American industry. For the first time, corporations were held accountable on such a scale for negligence that endangered the public. The case set precedents for stricter building codes, safety inspections, and corporate responsibility. No longer could companies simply cut corners without fear of consequence. The Great Molasses Flood had forced the law to recognize the deadly cost of negligence. Still, one question lingered, whispered in newspapers and among survivors. Why had it taken a disaster of this magnitude for action to be taken? The flaws in the tank had been obvious. The warnings had been loud. And yet, no one with power had listened, until it was too late. The investigation had answered the question of how the tank failed. But it could never answer the deeper question: how could so many people, for so long, ignore the danger staring them in the face? When the court rulings were done and the headlines began to fade, the people of Boston's North End were left with a reality far grimmer than any newspaper column could capture. The flood had passed in minutes, but its shadow would hang over the neighborhood for years. The cleanup alone became a Herculean task, a battle against nature and chemistry as much as against grief. Molasses is not like water, which recedes or evaporates. It sticks, it hardens, it lingers. In the immediate aftermath, the streets were coated in layers 2 to 3 feet deep. Men with shovels tried to carve paths, but their tools became heavy with sticky syrup, their boots cemented in place. Steam shovels were brought in, but even they struggled against the viscous mess, their treads clogging, their blades coated in brown residue. The city had to rely on fireboats from the harbor, spraying seawater onto the streets with immense pressure. Even then, the molasses refused to budge easily. It mixed with dirt, brick dust, and sewage, becoming a thick black slime that clung to every surface it touched. The North End became a nightmare landscape of stickiness. Doors would not close, windows were glued shut, sidewalks remained tacky underfoot. Horses left tracks in the sludge that hardened into fossil-like imprints. Clothing hung stiff on laundry lines, crusted with sugar that could not be washed away. Families swept molasses from their floors for weeks, then months. Even when the visible mess was gone, the smell remained, a sickly sweet, cloying odor that seeped into wood, brick, and stone. Survivors recalled that for years after, the entire neighborhood reeked of molasses whenever the weather turned hot. The cleanup spread far beyond the North End. Workers, coated in syrup, carried it on their clothes and boots into the subway, the trains, the offices of downtown Boston. Reports from the time describe handrails on trolleys sticky to the touch, telephones gummed up, even the steps of the State House bearing faint tacky stains. Everything a Bostonian touched was sticky, one newspaper lamented. It became a citywide nuisance, a reminder of tragedy on every doorknob and chair. For the families of the victims, the cleanup was not only physical but emotional. Funerals were held in rapid succession, often with closed caskets because the syrup had disfigured the dead beyond recognition. Grieving parents and widows walked through streets that still smelled of the substance that had killed their loved ones, a constant reminder of how quickly life had been swept away. Survivors spoke of nightmares, waves of molasses crashing through their dreams, loved ones' faces coated and suffocating, the sound of muffled screams echoing in their ears. Children who had survived grew into adults who flinched at the smell of anything sweet, unable to eat gingerbread or candy without recalling the taste of death. The psychological scars were deep. Trauma was not a concept widely understood at the time, but the North End lived with it daily. Some families moved away entirely, unable to face the reminders. Those who stayed found their community defined by the flood, as though every conversation, every gathering circled back to that January day. For years, the phrase molasses flood hung in the air like a curse, unspoken but never forgotten. The neighborhood itself bore visible scars. Entire blocks had been reshaped, buildings rebuilt on warped foundations or replaced with new structures altogether. The firehouse was reconstructed, but firefighters spoke of hearing echoes in the night, phantom cries of comrades buried under sticky rubble. Shops reopened, but business was slow. Tourists came not to buy, but to gawk, treating the site of tragedy as spectacle. Locals bristled at the intrusion, their grief turned into a curiosity for outsiders. Yet out of the devastation, some change did come. The trial and the publicity it attracted forced Boston to rethink its relationship with industry. Regulations were tightened, inspections became mandatory, and corporations were reminded they could no longer hide behind wealth and influence. In that sense, the North End's suffering forced a measure of progress, though few would say the price was worth it. Still, for ordinary Bostonians, the disaster remained a wound that never fully healed. The cleanup officially lasted weeks, but in truth, it never truly ended. Even years later, molasses lingered in unexpected places, seeping from cracks in walls, pooling in basements, surfacing from the harbor mud. Divers decades later claimed they could still smell it beneath the waterline, as if the city itself had absorbed the flood into its bones. Generations passed, but the memory of the flood became part of Boston's folklore. Parents told their children stories of the day the streets ran brown, of the wave that moved like a living thing. Some told it with horror, others with a strange note of humor, an attempt, perhaps, to lighten the unbearable. Jokes emerged in newspapers about slow deaths and sticky situations, but for the families of the dead, there was no laughter. The North End remained forever marked. Where once stood a neighborhood of immigrant families, now stood a monument of tragedy. And though life eventually resumed, the people never forgot. They rebuilt, they carried on, but in the cracks of the cobblestones and the whispers of the alleys, the flood lived on. Even today, over a century later, some locals claim that on hot summer days, when the air is heavy and the harbor breeze drifts through the narrow streets, a faint sweetness lingers. The scent of molasses, carried on the wind, a ghost of the disaster that drowned a city in sugar. It is as if the earth itself remembers, refusing to let the past be buried. The aftermath of the flood was not just a story of cleanup or rebuilding. It was a story of identity, how a community was forever tied to a single moment of catastrophe. The North End was no longer simply an immigrant enclave. It was the place where molasses killed. And for its residents, that identity was both a burden and a bond. They were survivors, witnesses to one of history's strangest disasters, bound together by grief and resilience. The Great Molasses Flood had reshaped Boston not only physically but psychologically. It was a warning written in syrup and steel, a reminder that progress without oversight could drown the innocent. And though buildings would rise again, though streets would be scrubbed and businesses reopened, the neighborhood's heart beat differently after 1919. Every creak of wood, every groan of steel, carried with it a shadow. The molasses was gone, but the memory never left. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 might have been expected to fade into obscurity, remembered only by the families who lived through it and the courtrooms that dissected it. But the disaster has proven strangely persistent in memory, resurfacing again and again in the city's folklore, in scientific studies, and even in popular culture. Its very strangeness, the sheer absurdity of death by syrup, has kept it alive in ways more conventional tragedies sometimes are not. In the years immediately following, the flood remained a source of raw grief. Families remembered loved ones lost, neighbors recounted the horror in hushed tones. But by the mid-20th century, as generations shifted, the story began to morph. The tragedy, once spoken of with shock, began to carry a strange dual identity, part horror, part curiosity. Children growing up in Boston heard whispers of the day the streets ran brown. Teachers told students about it as an odd footnote in local history, a bizarre cautionary tale that seemed almost too strange to be real. Journalists kept the story alive as well. On anniversaries of the disaster, articles would appear, recounting the wave of molasses that tore through the North End. Writers often struck a peculiar balance between tragedy and novelty, acknowledging the suffering but also marveling at the surreal imagery. Horses mired in syrup, men wading knee-deep through sticky streets. These accounts made the flood an enduring curiosity, a story that captured the imagination precisely because it seemed so unbelievable. For scientists and engineers, the flood became more than folklore, it was a case study. In the decades that followed, structural engineers analyzed the collapse of the tank, pointing to flaws in construction and material. Metallurgists highlighted the brittleness of the steel, lacking sufficient manganese. Legal scholars studied the trial, noting its impact on corporate liability and safety regulation. The disaster, in effect, became a turning point not only in Boston's history but in industrial oversight across America. Engineering students today still read about it as an example of catastrophic design failure, grouped alongside bridge collapses and factory fires. But beyond the courtroom and the classroom, the flood seeped into culture in unexpected ways. Folklore wrapped it in a layer of myth. Locals told stories that on hot summer days, the North End still smelled faintly of molasses, as though the earth itself remembered. Some claimed the ghosts of victims lingered, their cries carried on the breeze. Ghost tours in Boston today often include the flood, weaving it into the city's haunted identity. Writers of fiction, too, have drawn on the flood. It appears in novels, short stories, and even children's literature, sometimes presented with solemnity, other times with dark humor. The image of a syrup wave engulfing a city is so bizarre, so vivid, that it refuses to be forgotten. Artists and musicians have referenced it, comedians have joked about it, and television shows have dramatized it. In a way, the flood has become both a symbol of absurd tragedy and a metaphor for the unexpected forces that can sweep through ordinary lives. At the same time, descendants of the victims continue to preserve its memory with reverence. Local historical societies mark anniversaries with ceremonies, plaques, and lectures. In 2019, the centennial of the disaster, Boston held events to honor the dead and reflect on the lessons learned. Survivors' families gathered, sharing stories passed down through generations. Newspapers once again filled with accounts of the day the tank burst, blending the voices of those who lived it with the research of historians and scientists. One of the most enduring legacies of the flood is its role in shaping safety standards. The trial established that corporations could not simply hide behind claims of ignorance. They had a duty to ensure public safety, a responsibility enforceable in law. That precedent rippled outward, influencing future regulations on everything from building codes to workplace safety. The molasses flood, in its tragic absurdity, became part of the backbone of American industrial accountability. And yet, even with its serious consequences, the flood retains its strangeness. Tourists visiting Boston often hear about Paul Revere's ride, the Boston Tea Party, the Salem witch trials, and then, unexpectedly, about the molasses flood. It stands out because it feels surreal, a disaster that reads like satire but was all too real. For many, that juxtaposition is what keeps the story alive, the way it blends horror with disbelief, tragedy with peculiarity. In Boston itself, the flood remains woven into identity. The North End, now a bustling neighborhood known for Italian food and cultural vibrancy, still carries echoes of 1919. Plaques mark the site of the disaster. Walking tours recount the event with equal parts gravity and fascination. Residents, even if generations removed, feel a strange connection to it, an awareness that their streets were once ground zero for a catastrophe that drew the eyes of the world. The legacy of the flood also endures in language. Writers and journalists continue to reference it whenever strange or overwhelming forces strike. Headlines about floods, spills, or industrial accidents sometimes invoke the molasses flood as shorthand for chaos. In sports, commentators have compared sluggish teams to moving like molasses in January, a phrase with chilling resonance in Boston. The disaster, in short, has seeped into metaphor, becoming a cultural symbol beyond its immediate context. But for all its appearances in jokes, metaphors, and folklore, the human core of the disaster remains. Every anniversary, someone retells the names of the 21 who died: children, laborious, mothers, firefighters. Their lives were not a curiosity. They were cut short in agony, buried in syrup. And perhaps the strangest legacy of all is the tension between remembering the flood as a tragedy and retelling it as a bizarre anecdote. The two identities coexist uneasily, much like the flood itself, both absurd and horrific, both surreal and devastating. Over a century later, the Great Molasses Flood remains one of history's strangest disasters. It has never faded entirely, because it speaks to something deeper than syrup and steel. It speaks to the fragility of human systems, the consequences of negligence, and the way catastrophe can arrive in the most unexpected form. It is remembered not just because it was bizarre, but because it was real, because ordinary people, going about their lives, were drowned in sweetness that became suffocation. The flood lingers, not just in Boston's bricks and cobblestones, but in the imagination. It is at once a warning and a legend, a symbol of how fragile safety can be, and how bizarrely history can turn. Why does the Great Molasses Flood still matter more than a century later? After all, in the scale of human tragedy, 21 deaths might appear small compared to wars, fires, or plagues. And yet, the disaster refuses to be forgotten. It clings to memory the way molasses clung to Boston streets in 1919. Sticky, stubborn, impossible to wash away. Part of its endurance lies in its sheer strangeness. Death by syrup sounds almost comical at first hearing, something out of dark satire rather than history. The image of a tidal wave of molasses rolling through a city feels absurd. And yet, that absurdity masks the reality. Lives were violently ended, bodies suffocated, families shattered. The bizarre nature of the event makes it unforgettable, but it is the human suffering that gives it weight. The laughter quickly dies when you remember the details: the muffled screams, the children pulled under, the horses shot to end their agony. Another reason the flood lingers is what it reveals about negligence and power. The molasses tank was known to be faulty. Residents saw it leak for years. Workers knew it groaned and strained under pressure. Complaints were made, but the company dismissed them. Profit mattered more than safety. The flood was not simply an accident, it was the physical manifestation of disregard, the price paid for corporate shortcuts. When the tank burst, it wasn't just steel that failed, it was responsibility. And the people who died did so not because of anarchists or saboteurs, but because those in charge believed appearances were enough. Paint over the leaks, they thought, and no one will notice. That lesson resonates far beyond 1919. Even today, disasters strike when warnings are ignored, when corners are cut, when profit eclipses precaution. Oil spills, building collapses, chemical leaks, the stories change, but the root cause is often the same. The molasses flood is not just a relic of history. It is a mirror reflecting patterns that repeat, reminding us of the cost of negligence. The disaster also reshaped the law. The trial that followed forced corporations to recognize their duty to the public, establishing precedents for accountability. Safety inspections, building codes, and liability standards were strengthened because of the molasses flood. In that sense, the victims left behind more than grief. They left a legacy of protection that has saved lives in the decades since. Every modern safety standard carries echoes of that sticky wave on Commercial Street. And yet, there is something deeper that makes the flood unforgettable, the way it blurs the line between the ordinary and the catastrophic. Molasses was mundane. It was food, sweetness, the stuff of gingerbread and candy. No one feared it. No one imagined it could kill. And yet, in one terrible moment, the ordinary became monstrous. The same substance that flavored cookies became a suffocating tide that drowned children. That transformation shocks the imagination, because it reveals how fragile the boundary is between safety and disaster. It is that fragility that lingers. The flood reminds us that catastrophe can come not only from storms or bombs, but from the most unlikely of places. A tank of syrup, a machine in a factory, a pipeline under the ground. Any can become instruments of death if ignored, if mismanaged, if underestimated. The molasses flood warns us to take nothing for granted, to question the structures we live beside, and to remember that what seems harmless can turn deadly in a moment. For Boston, the flood remains a scar and a legend. In the North End, the smell of molasses was said to linger for decades, especially on hot summer days. Locals claimed they could still taste it in the air, as though the earth itself exhaled the memory of the disaster. Whether literal or imagined, that lingering sweetness became a ghost, a reminder that the past does not simply vanish. Tragedies leave traces, in buildings, in laws, in stories passed down from parent to child. On the centennial in 2019, Boston paused to remember. Descendants of the victims gathered at the site, reading aloud the names of the dead. Historians revisited the trial. Engineers discussed the science of failure. But beyond the speeches and plaques, there was something quieter, a recognition that the flood, bizarre as it was, still matters because it embodies the vulnerability of human life against forces larger than ourselves. We like to think we control our world. We build tanks, bridges, factories, and cities with the belief that they are solid, permanent, safe. The molasses flood shatters that illusion. It shows us how fragile safety is, how quickly control can dissolve. A single crack in steel, a single decision to ignore a leak, and suddenly, the unthinkable becomes real. That, perhaps, is the most haunting legacy of all, the reminder that history's strangest disasters are not random. They are born of choices, of human errors, of warnings unheeded. And if it happened once, it can happen again. Different form, different city, same pattern. So when we remember the Great Molasses Flood, we are not just recalling a bizarre moment when syrup drowned a city. We are remembering the lives lost, the negligence exposed, the lessons carved in tragedy. We are remembering the way sweetness turned to suffocation, the way laughter turned to silence. And perhaps, on some level, we are remembering that the world is never as safe as it seems. The Great Molasses Flood still matters because it is not only about molasses. It is about us, our hubris, our blindness, our resilience. It is about the people who suffered, the families who mourned, the city that rebuilt, and the lesson that still echoes. Never underestimate the ordinary, never ignore the cracks, and never forget that catastrophe waits where we least expect it. A century has passed, but the flood remains. In Boston's memory, in America's laws, in the cautionary tales we tell, it lingers, dark, sticky, unforgettable. The day molasses drowned a city is not just a story of the past. It is a warning for the future. The streets of Boston's North End look different now. Where once stood the towering steel tank, today there are playgrounds, apartment buildings, and the constant hum of city life. Children laugh where workers once shoveled sticky debris. Cars roll smoothly where, a century ago, horses thrashed and men waded waist-deep through syrup. Time has layered new life over the site of devastation, as it always does. And yet, beneath the pavement and bricks, the ground remembers. For decades after 1919, locals swore that on humid summer days, the air still carried the faint, sweet scent of molasses, a ghostly perfume rising from the soil, as if the earth itself exhaled the memory of that day. Whether truth or folklore, the story persists, passed from generation to generation, a whispered reminder that some stains cannot be washed away, no matter how many decades pass. The Great Molasses Flood is not just a relic of Boston's history. It is part of a larger human story, one that repeats itself whenever warnings are ignored, whenever profit outweighs safety, whenever ordinary life collides with the consequences of negligence. We tell this story not only to marvel at its strangeness, but to confront its meaning. The people of Boston were not drowned by an act of nature. They were drowned by a structure built on carelessness, ignored until it failed. Look closer, and the echoes are everywhere. In the rusting bridges that collapse without warning. In the factories where alarms go unanswered. In the pipelines that burst across neighborhoods. The molasses flood is a metaphor for the fragility of human certainty, for the belief that what surrounds us is solid, permanent, safe. But steel buckles. Concrete cracks. Warnings go unheeded. And when they do, lives are changed forever. What makes the story so haunting is the contradiction it holds. Molasses is sweetness, comfort, a flavor tied to home and warmth. Yet on that January day, it became terror. A substance meant to nourish became an instrument of death. That duality unsettles us, the idea that something harmless could so suddenly become monstrous. It lingers because it feels symbolic of life itself, how quickly the ordinary can turn, how easily safety becomes peril. For those who lived through it, the flood was not a curiosity. It was trauma. Survivors carry the memory in their bodies, in their nightmares, in the empty spaces left by those who never came home. Mothers grieved children lost in the syrup. Families buried their dead beneath the shadow of a tank that had never been safe. That grief deserves more than laughter at the absurdity of death by molasses. It demands remembrance of the human cost. Today, plaques and memorials mark the spot, ensuring that the dead are not forgotten. Historians recount the trial, scientists explain the mechanics, and Boston's ghost tours weave the story into the city's haunted tapestry. But even with explanations and memorials, the flood resists closure. It remains surreal, hovering between tragedy and legend, between history and myth. And maybe that is why it endures. The Great Molasses Flood forces us to wrestle with contradictions, sweetness and suffocation, absurdity and horror, negligence and accountability. It is a story that refuses to sit comfortably in one category. It is both a lesson in engineering failure and a ghost story whispered on humid nights. Both a legal precedent and a haunting urban legend. Both absurd and unforgettable. As the century turns into another, the flood lingers not only in Boston's memory but in our imagination. When we speak of it now, we are not just recalling the past, we are warning the future. Because the flood is more than molasses. It is a mirror, showing us what happens when we ignore danger, when we let arrogance dictate safety, when we assume the structures around us will never fail. The victims of January 15, 1919, could not have imagined that their final moments would echo for generations. Yet they do. Each retelling of the flood carries their memory forward. Each plaque, each article, each anniversary breathes life into their story. They remain with us, not just as names in a ledger, but as voices in history, whispering that negligence kills, that even the sweetest things can suffocate, and that memory itself can serve as justice. And so, when the summer heat rises and the air in Boston feels heavy, some still say the scent of molasses returns. Whether it truly does or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is that we remember. The Great Molasses Flood was not just a bizarre footnote. It was a tragedy, a turning point, a warning written in syrup across the cobblestones of Boston. To forget it would be to invite its lesson to repeat. History is filled with disasters. Some fade, others linger. This one lingers, sticky, sweet, grotesque, because it is too strange to dismiss and too human to ignore. The day molasses drowned a city is gone. But the story remains. And maybe, that faint sweetness in the air is not molasses at all. Maybe it is history itself, reminding us that the past never truly lets go.